My name is Alex Johnston, and I am the co-chair of the board of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, commonly known as MISC, and I am your MC this evening. On behalf of MISC and our partner for this event, that clap was started by my husband. On behalf of MISC and our partner for this event, CBC Radio-Canada, I am delighted to welcome you in such great numbers to the inaugural conversation sponsored by Charles Bronfman. Merci beaucoup de vous être déplacés en grand nombre en cette fin de journée d'éclipse pour assister à cet événement exceptionnel. I wish to start our proceedings with our land acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge that McGill University and the Centre Montréal, where we are assembled tonight, are located on land which long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous people whose footsteps have marked this territory on which peoples of the world now gather. Let me start by reminding all of us that MISC would not exist if it were not for Charles Bronfman. He was the driving force behind our creation 30 years ago. He believed that it is critical for Canadians to know more about our country. Thanks to him, we have built an internationally recognized program on 3 pillars: public education, research, and undergraduate education. Public education is at the heart of what we do, and tonight's event is our centerpiece. As we prepared to celebrate our 30th birthday, Charles felt we needed to expand our horizons, which is why we are here tonight at the best attended event in MISC's history. When we asked Charles about a year ago why he made his generous gift to endow this annual event, this is what he said. I keep on wondering about Canada and where it is positioned in the world as opposed to where it should be positioned. We don't take as much advantage as we should of the neighborhood we are in. We can be the senior of the middle-sized countries. We have abdicated that role and are no longer consequential on a global stage. Canada is a very special nation. It has a lot of things, including its natural and human resources. I'm curious whether a university system can be a leader, like in the US or the UK, to lead Canada to a more important position in the world. We are facing some important issues, and we need to take stock of where we are. He went on to ask us, can we start to position Canada through conversations in a more relevant way to what is going on in the world? I hope that the Charles Bronfman conversations would be serious enough and important enough to have some influence on government policy. I've always loved this country. I feel like Canada is a wonderful country and can continue to get better. So tonight, with our panel of experts who have flown in from 3 different countries to be here this evening, we start that conversation. But first, I would like to call upon McGill's president, Dean Saini, to set the stage.
Merci Alex et bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Chers distingués invités, chers membres de la communauté mcgilloise, bienvenue au tout premier épisode de la série Conversation. Good evening and welcome to the inaugural episode of the Conversations, a signature discussion series that is sponsored by Charles Bronfman. We are here this evening thanks to Mr. Bronfman's lifelong passion for deepening understandings of Canada among Canadians. By expanding our conceptions of Canadian history, politics, and policy, Conversations will help propel the reimagining of Canada's potential in an ever-changing world. On behalf of all of us at McGill, let me say thank you, Mr. Bronfman, for giving us this opportunity to hear diverse perspectives, to listen, and to learn. Thank you very much. This evening, we will tackle a most timely question. How can Canada, and of course its peer countries, protect liberal democracy and civility in the face of rising authoritarianism and distrust in democracy? Il n'y a pas de solution simple, mais une chose est sûre. L'éducation est un puissant rempart. Universities have a multifaceted role to play in this regard. We are the arbiters of truth in this post-truth world, and we are the town square of our society. That is, we are one of the few remaining forums of civil, critical debate among people of diverse perspectives. In fulfilling our mission, we aim to instill in our students a sense of civic responsibility, an openness to dissenting views, and a lifelong passion for learning, elements that are foundational to a thriving democracy. And without a doubt, events such as this contribute to advancing all these goals in meaningful ways. To our three distinguished panelists today, Rosalie Sibelman Abella, Louis Liberto Barroso, and Vikas Swarup, we look forward to hearing your perspective this evening. Thank you for being here, and thank you, Nalayad, if you're listening, wherever you are on the other side of the stage, for moderating. I now have the great honor to introduce Mr. Charles Bronfman, esteemed business person, a most dedicated philanthropist, as well as co-founder and member of the board of the McGill Institute for Study of Canada. Please join me in warmly welcoming Mr. Bronfman to the stage as he shares some of his reflections with us. Merci et bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Thank you very much.
How do you pronounce your name?
I just want to say to open that Misk and McGill
You don't have to say.
will not be,
You don't have to say.
oh hell, I just forgot. You know, you get old, you forget things. I had it all figured out. What happened this afternoon? We had a... McGill and Misk will not be eclipsed by any happenings during the day. Pardonnez-moi, I had French written out, but between the President and Mademoiselle Johnson, they took it away from me, so I'll have to do it in that other language. But why the title? Why Conversations? And I think it came to me a few years ago when there was an annual MISC conference, and the late and, in my opinion, great Prime Minister Brian Mulroney and Secretary of State at the time Brian was in office, James Baker, were reminiscing Baker in Houston on television and Brian in a room somewhat smaller than this, talking with each other and reminiscing about what had gone on, particularly with the free trade negotiations between these two countries. And I said, my goodness, these warriors, wonderful warriors, they're not talking as people who just had a bang-up fight together. They're talking meaningfully about a lot of important things that they accomplished together. They're having a conversation. And maybe that's what we need. Maybe we shouldn't have debates where you have people who either win or lose, score brownie points or don't score brownie points. Maybe conversations about subjects rather than debates about subjects are what we need. So we formed a committee, and what you now are about to hear is the result of a lot of wonderful work by a bunch of wonderful people. And I would like to thank some of the people who were involved in all that. Talking about the late and, in my opinion, again, great Brian Mulroney, I would like to thank Jean Charest for his wonderful eulogy at Brian's funeral on the history of that fine man's political career. It was done with great emotion. And it was done with heart, and it was quite a statement. I also, while we're welcoming people, I think that Alex Johnson's father is here. Now, you may not know this gentleman is Alex Johnson's father. You may remember him as the principal at that time and vice chancellor of McGill, or you might recognize him as Canada's Governor General. David Johnson, are you here? Can we see you? Okay. So I'd like to thank a number of people, and then we'll get on with the show. Initiatives like this have many parents, and I would like to acknowledge some of them. The late Des Morton, who put the Institute on the map as its first and excellent director. Antonia Maioni, his successor, whose enthusiasm and support was the real catalyst in developing this concept. Daniel Bélan, our current director, whose team has organized tonight's inaugural event, and Daniel has worked his tail off to make sure that this evening would be a success. The advisory committee and its chair, who you heard before, Alex Johnson. She has been so wonderful. David, I don't know if you can understand how wonderful a daughter you have. I know that I don't understand how wonderful mine is, and she is. President Deep Saini, whose clear vision for McGill University includes programs like Conversations. Our partners at the CBC, who will bring exchange to a wide audience beyond these walls. And especially our panelists for their willingness to bring their experience and expertise to this conversation, setting a high standard for subsequent years. Special accolades to Justice Abella, who has been instrumental in getting them here. And to my colleague and friend, Ann Dadson, who nursed this conversation since its inception. We all love this wonderful country. My hope is that programs like this will help us question and consider how we develop as a nation, one with an important role to play in the world. Merci, thank you.
It's like the complimentary father I never had. Thank you, President Saini, and thank you very much, Charles. I would like to now call on a Canadian treasure, the award-winning journalist Nala Ayed, who will moderate tonight's discussion. Now the host of Ideas, Nala previously worked as a journalist in the Middle East, where she spent nearly a decade covering the region's many conflicts. And later, while based in London, she covered many of the major stories of our time: Russia's annexation of Crimea, Europe's refugee crisis, the Brexit vote and its fallout. What better person to lead a discussion of international experts on the threat of civility and the fight for liberal democracy? Nala, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alex. Good evening, everyone. The series, as mentioned, is about conversations. But if you look around, the conversation writ large has descended into an intractable shouting match, and it's getting worse. Who here in this room or listening to us right now isn't alarmed by the insults online and in real life, at the threats of violence directed at our leaders, politicians, and judges, the very people who are supposed to safeguard our rights and democracy itself? How did public discourse, our most consequential conversations, become so debased? And when, in turn, did elected leaders and politicians, some elected leaders and politicians, get the permission to talk and behave like schoolyard bullies? Why does it seem that every difference of opinion turns into an existential one, ruling out joint pursuits of common goals, even as benign as a more just and equitable world. If we think of liberal democracy as a kind of faith-based system without the theology, it really feels as though that faith is being undermined from above and from below. And not only in countries where there's a rise of authoritarianism and democratic recession, but in countries that have long prided themselves on jealously safeguarding their democracies, like the United States, the UK, India, Brazil, and here in Canada. In short, we're in a crisis of faith, a crisis of authority, a crisis of civility, so there's a lot at stake, and that's why we're here now, to have a real conversation about how we got here, and how we can restore civility, and by that, we don't just mean politeness. Joining me tonight, and I won't be able to do them all justice, very short bios here, are three eminent panelists. I'll begin with Rosalie Silberman-Abella, a former justice of the Supreme Court of Canada and is currently the Samuel and Judith Pizar Chair at Harvard Law School. She was the first Jewish woman and refugee to serve on the Ontario Family Court, the Ontario Court of Appeal, and the Supreme Court of Canada. Among her many, many contributions to legal thought and jurisprudence, no time to list them all here, Justice Abella's definition of equality and discrimination were adopted by the Supreme Court in 1989. Justice Abella, please welcome to the stage. Welcome back. Welcome back. Luis Roberto Barroso is a Brazilian law professor and outspoken jurist. He joined the Federal Supreme Court of Brazil in 2013 and was sworn in as president last September. He's known for his fierce defense of human rights and the independence of the judiciary. He was instrumental in the Supreme Court's 2023 ruling that found former President Bolsonaro guilty of abuse of power, barring him from holding office until 2030. Justice Barroso is a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. Justice Barroso. Welcome. Great to see you. Last but not least, Vikas Swarup is a retired Indian diplomat. He joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1986 and served in diplomatic assignments in Ankara, Washington, Addis Ababa, London, Pretoria, and Osaka or Kobe. And of course, from 2017 to 2019, he was India's High Commissioner to Canada. In 2023, he served as the inaugural global thought leader in residence at the University of Guelph. Mr. Swarup is also an accomplished writer and novelist. His debut novel, Q&A, was adapted for cinema as Slumdog Millionaire. It won 8 Oscars, as many of you will know, including the award for Best Picture. Please welcome Mr. Swarup. A very, very warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming all this way to be with us tonight. I'd like to start with you, Rosie, if I may.
Justice Rosie.
Justice Rosie. I did get permission before we started.
You did.
I did. I want to ask you a really simple question. Beyond the idea of politeness, what does civility mean to you?
What's your simple question? Civility. I mean, I guess starting with that is the right way to go. Simple answer, civility is what we don't have in the United States. And I think the fear everyone has is that the conversations we used to have with each other when there were shared values and an international consensus about what democracy meant, what human rights meant, what justice meant, has so fragmented. Enhanced, I think, by an inappropriate religious obedience to the idea of free speech. And I worry now that Roberto and I have spent some time in the United States, and I don't know how you feel, Vikas, the idea of speech being the towering metaphor for what democracy means without any understanding of the difference qualitatively in the kind of speech is menacing. And I remember once hearing Steve Martin say there's a difference between yelling fire in a crowded theater and yelling theater in a crowded fire hall. And unless we make distinctions about what kind of speech we tolerate, which includes learning how to listen to each other instead of yelling at each other, we're not going to be able to figure out where our common goals are. And I think that's been the main problem in the absence of civility. And it's tied to the concept of liberal democracy. Because you cannot have a cohesive respect for liberal democracy unless you have a willingness to debate each other about differences of opinion and figure out where to go given these different points of view. What's the path forward? So right now, everybody's in silos. People want their silos to go forward, and they don't know how to talk past those silos to each other. They want to win the argument, and that's not a conversation. So it's the component of listening, I think, that has to come back into conversations.
You've set the stage for us, the macro, and we're going to come back to these ideas over and over in this conversation. But I'd like to look at a couple of micro situations. Roberto, if I could ask you, in 2021, in addition to being a judge in the Supreme Court, you were also head of the Supreme Electoral Court in Brazil, when then President Bolsonaro criticized you publicly. What happened?
He more than criticized me, he insulted me a couple times.
He insulted you?
Yeah. Nala, I've had many years of psychoanalysis. So whenever someone behaves improperly towards me, I know it's the other person's problem. And what happened then, I never took it personal. It was an institutional problem for me. The reason why he was so upset was Brazil has a wonderful electronic voting machine systems that has eliminated frauds in Brazil. And he wanted to go back to paper voting, to paper ballots, which in Brazil has always meant fraud in the electoral process. So I opposed that fiercely, and I was invited to Congress, and I fortunately was able to convince Congress members not to approve going back to paper ballot. And the president was very upset for that reason. And now I can tell that was probably the most important thing I've done during my time at the court, because if, as we learned with the January 8th episode, that those people were able to invade Congress, to invade the Supreme Court, to invade the presidential palace, just imagine what they would have done to the electoral stations where the votes were being counted, where they thought they would lose. So it was a low price to pay, the insulting, because eventually democracy won in Brazil.
But it was a first. I mean, you've been a judge for a very long time. Had you ever been addressed with such sharp words?
Oh, no. It was even swearing words. It was unimaginable. It's even hard to... These people, sometimes you feel like they live in a different spiritual dimension, to be true.
Vikas, as a diplomat, we've listed all the places that you've been based. You've had a front row seat to the spread of this kind of thing around the world. And I wonder, the targeting of people, the targeting of institutions, you've seen a number of examples. What sticks out in your mind as kind of one of the starkest examples?
So, Nala, I would say that the biggest threat facing democratic institutions comes from your giant neighbor to the south. The United States is rightly regarded as the mother lode of democracy. And yet, there is no advanced industrial democracy in the world today that is more ideologically divided and more politically dysfunctional than the United States today. there is extreme political polarization. It has gone even beyond red versus blue, rural versus urban, to resemble almost something tribal in character. And as a result, the two political parties are unable to agree on anything, from healthcare to climate change to women's reproductive rights to even aid to Ukraine. On top of that, one party refuses to accept defeat in an election, which, to my mind, undermines the very basis of liberal democracy and can only lead to further erosion of trust in democratic institutions and processes. And 3 years ago, the January 6th attack on the US Congress, I think, exemplified the dangers of such an approach. Thirdly, we are seeing that the power to set government policy is becoming increasingly disconnected from public opinion, with an activist Supreme Court which has become totally partisan itself. And many of its recent judgments, many commentators are saying, reflect more the ideological leanings of the justices than the broader public interest. And finally, you have a concerted effort by some politicians and states to restrict access to voting, to pass laws which particularly target minority groups and marginalized communities. So matters have reached such a point that a very respected political scientist, Barbara Walter from San Diego University, has actually said in her book that the US is closer to a civil war than we could ever imagine. And of course, this is not going to be a traditional civil war. She says this will be fought really a guerrilla warfare among rival militia groups all across the country. So I would say that because America is the most influential country in the world, it is not only the world's largest economy and most powerful military, but it also sets the cultural benchmarks, technology, culture. So if America succumbs to the erosion of its democratic values and norms, then I think that will have a very, very deleterious impact on liberal democracy worldwide.
So if we stay with the US example, and as I said earlier, faith in liberal democracy is being undermined from above and from below. And if we stick with the attacks from above, Rosie, another easy question for you. In a nutshell, how did we get to a place where a political leader elected can score points by attacking institutions like courts that are meant to protect democracy?
Well, I think you've heard from both of these speakers about the importance of having an independent judiciary. It's crucial to a democracy, and I think one of the rhetorical tools that have been used by people in the United States and elsewhere, wherever there's an authoritarian regime, is the perversion of the word democracy from what we had originally understood it to be, certainly after World War II understood it to be, as a series of checks and balances that includes an independent judiciary, a strong and independent press, protection for minorities, religious rights, freedom of assembly and association. It's the collection of those rights with a legislature which is responsible to the majority. I mean, you lose your seat if you don't do what your population wants. And then having another body, like the courts, which can say, we don't have to represent the majority, we have independence, we have, in most places, term limits, and so we are free to be unpopular on behalf of interests that may not be popular. Minority rights, for instance. When that breaks down and you have, as you have in the United States, a court that is not protecting the interests of anyone other than perspectives of one political party, that's an erosion of confidence in democracy generally. And if we allow the conversation about democracy, if we accede to those who want to say democracy means majorities and elections, the way Bolsonaro did, the way Erdogan did, the way Orban does, then you are ignoring the fact that that has never been what liberal democracy is. So we have to take back the conversation from those who will not acknowledge the importance of those separate functions and rights, because at the moment, I think the public is confused. They also think democracy means votes. So Votes are the beginning of the democratic conversation. You're putting in one of the players, but it's really crucial to have those other protections through the media and the courts, to have those other interests looked after. And it's very hard to teach constitutional law in the United States, for instance, because the paradigm is legislatures responsible to majorities, courts independent, responsive to what they think the Constitution demands based on the evidence and the arguments, but not worried about what the public will say. I don't know what public opinion means anyway, and we don't take polls at the courts. Do you take polls at the court? No. So we've lost the ability to hold on to that strain, and teaching it when you've got symmetry between the people who are squashing rights and determining whether those rights have been squashed, and there's nobody kind of examining whether they're doing it properly because they change the rules all the time, you've got a problem. And Vikas is right. People watch what goes on in the United States. But it is not happening in many other democracies, like Canada. And I think Canada really has so much to show the world in how to do it, which doesn't mean you have to agree with everything, but the institutions know what they're there to do and have been doing them, the press, the courts, and the legislatures.
I mean, there are so many factors that go into answering that question that I was asking, and you've pointed out several of them. You know, there's the social media impact, there's the tone that is set, the tonal dance set by the leaders who are elected by different countries. I just wonder if we could hear from you, Vikas, and also from you, Roberto, about what you think is the primary driver of this, I guess for lack of a better word, uncivility. What's the biggest catalyst, do you think?
Can I step in on this?
Absolutely.
Previous question? As Rosie was saying, democracy is like a coin with its two faces. In one face, you're talking about popular sovereignty, free and fair elections, and the rule of the majority. But there's the other side, that is the side of limited power, rule of the law, and protection of fundamental rights. And so usually you have Supreme Courts that arbitrate the tensions between both sides, between the rule of the majority and the protection of fundamental rights. What happens, or what happened in the world, was that with the rise of authoritarian populism and this emphasis in the majoritarian part of the side of the coin, the populist leaders, they kind of establish a direct relation with their supporters. They bypass intermediate institutions. And one particularity of authoritarian populism, they need an enemy. And in most countries, it didn't happen in the US, but in most countries, the elected enemy is the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court has the role to curb the power of the majority. So in Brazil, in Hungary, in Poland, in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, in Turkey, in Russia, this is what happened. It was always the same process.
It's a playbook. It's the way you've described it in the past. I just wonder what it is.
Except where the courts have already been captured.
Right.
If you know what I mean.
But I'm curious what you think it is about the time we live in now that makes that bypassing compelling. What is it about that willingness to jump and go direct to the people, do you think, what is it about this time that makes that approach so compelling to people?
Well, I won't blame polarization, because I think polarization has always existed. If you take two modern democracies, in the US, you had from the beginning the Republicans and the Federalists. If you look at France, you had the left and the right. So polarization is not to be blamed there, I think. What I think that happened was a major change in the way we communicate. And I think the digital revolution plays a major role in that process, because it had a positive side, which is to democratize access to information and knowledge and to the public sphere. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, it allowed for the unfiltered access to the public space with misinformation, lies, slanders. It created tribes that only talk to themselves.
Sure.
And it brought a crisis to the business model of the traditional press, which was responsible for emphasizing, creating a base of common facts after which we could disagree, but we would agree on the facts. So the problem that we're facing these days is that people just create their own narratives according to their preferences. And we are not sharing, we don't share common values, as Rosie said, but worse than that, we don't share the common facts. So people just develop their own narratives. And so we're just talking like, this is a blue pen. And after that, you can say, I don't like blue, I don't like imported pens. But if someone says that this is a tire, we lose the capacity of communicating. And I think that's what happened in the world.
Vikas, I'd like to explore, take a step from that slightly and go back to kind of the top-down attack and explore the effect of the actual leaders. I just want to read something to you. A study by the Pew Research Center reported earlier this year suggested that support for authoritarianism across the world is more widespread than one might think. It found that in India, for example, 85% of respondents support having a strong leader who can make decisions without parliament or the courts, or they support military rule. And just so that we don't single out India, this is support that's fairly high in a number of other countries as well. What do these kind of leaders appear to offer when they're kind of unconstrained by these checks and balances? What are they offering?
Look, I mean, when I first read the results of this Pew survey, I was also astounded, because its overall conclusion is that some 31% of people in 24 countries support some form of authoritarian government. And India, of course, it went up to 85%, which frankly I find unbelievable. And then I delved deeper into it, and I discovered that they had a sample size of 2,611, which in a nation of 1.4 billion might not be very representative.
Why are you saying that's not representative?
Yeah, because you see, 72% of Indians also said that they are very happy with the functioning of democracy in India.
Yeah.
And those Indians who are pining for a military dictatorship, well, I have bad news for them. Civilian control over the armed forces is a bedrock of Indian democracy, and I don't think that's going to change. Other things might change, but I don't think that's going to change. But at the same time, I think the Pew survey does point out to the increasing disillusionment with liberal democracy. And of course, there are several reasons for that. I think one of the primary reasons is that there is a crisis of representation. You know, the ordinary person feels that the elected representatives neither represent him, neither represent his interests or her interests correctly.
Yeah.
So that is one. Secondly, I would say the world is now going through a very turbulent phase. I mean, as a diplomat for 35 years, I can tell you, I have never seen geopolitics evolve more rapidly than it is doing so today. I call it geopolitics on steroids. And as a result, you are having mutually reinforcing shocks that are happening with increasing certainty, increasing frequency.
Sure.
First, you had the refugee crisis, which upended a lot of Europe. Then you had Brexit, you had the pandemic, you had the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which led to energy insecurity, food insecurity. You're having a massive global inflationary impact right now. People's income baskets are shrinking. So at this point in time, when there is instability, people are feeling a lot of volatility, if an authoritarian leader comes in and he says, I'm going to restore things as they were before, I'm going to bring order, I'm going to end this chaos, then obviously, there is a certain resonance with the kind of things that they are saying.
Sure.
The other point, I think, we must also not underestimate the cultural and religious sources of populist appeal. You see, in the technocratic world that we live in, many people say, James Carville's famous phrase, it's the economy is stupid, that everything can be settled just on the basis of the economy. But no, I think, so there are two, I think populists tap into two sources. One, of course, is the politics of grievance. And this is the politics of people who have been left behind by globalization, etc., whose incomes have not risen, and who feel that, they need a new leader who can drain the swamp and restore order. Right. But they also tap into the politics of hope. Yeah. I will make America great again. I will bring you back to a golden era. And that is also something that we have to acknowledge. That, much of politics is driven by the politics of hope, of aspiration. People want something that they can believe in, and they offer it to them.
Rosie, does it surprise you that 30% of Canadians also, support the idea of non-democratic alternatives?
Look, we don't have plexiglass between our borders. I mean, what happens around the world, I think, affects people here, but I want to offer an additional observation that may be 10,000 feet. And that is, aside from the fact that authoritarian governments, as soon as they come in, get rid of the media and the courts, replace it with their own people. So you develop a culture now that you've taken over the government of non-criticism. There's nobody there to tell the government what they can't do. But the other thing that happened a long time ago, and it's fueled now by social media, we cannot ignore the fact that a lot of people don't read newspapers. How are they getting the information that helps them decide whether democracy, as they understand it, is a good thing or a bad thing, or whether their government is good or bad? We've become so dependent on the opinions of people who do not have filtered facts, as Vic has said. But let me go even farther back. Somewhere along the way, I think part of the process of democratization, and this may be too theoretical, but it's something I've worried about for a while, is that we started some time ago, after making an international bargain that we would all protect the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the principles that came out of the Nuremberg trials, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. We made that bargain. That was an international bargain that we made to protect democracies and people's rights in them. And then suddenly, one by one, democracies didn't comply. And what happened to those democracies that didn't comply? Nothing. So we became a global culture that said, who are we to say that democracy is better? Liberal democracy. Who are we to say that having an independent media or judges is really so great? And so we allowed the world kind of step back with a sense of misplaced humility, didn't try to enforce the bargain that we came up with after the Second World War, and started to see acceptance of the intolerable. And here we are now trying to say, how do we get it back? Added to the factual disintegration of those institutions, you have what everybody knows, and that is the screaming and yelling and lying and fabrication that goes on without any way to verify. So grievance, unfiltered information, no factual foundation. When we were growing up, you had ABC News, NBC News. I don't want to be disrespectful to the Canadian press, but NBC, ABC, and CBS. They all had the same worldview. They may have differed on the modalities, but they had the same worldview. I think in Canada, so far, on the whole, the media pretty well emanates from the same set of values. There may be different emphases of perspective, but we are all coming from kind of the same place. But there's a whole culture out there of people who have no idea, and we don't have NBC, CBS, and ABC anymore in the United States. People read the Wall Street Journal, or if they read it all, or the Boston Globe, or they read the Sun newspaper, whatever. But they have their own pieces of information that confirm their worldview. And so when you say, how come this is all happening? It's because we allowed it to happen. Nobody said, you can't do this. This is against the deal we made when we set up the UN, when we created all of these organizations. And they exist, and it's frittered away. And I don't know how we're going to get it back, but I do know we have to get it back, at least where we can.
Roberto, go ahead.
Add something here. With this point that Rosie just stressed, where do we get our news from? And I think that was a major change, a major shift with the rise of social media, which was one of the main byproducts of the technological revolution. One very important thing, we lost kind of the editorial control that you would have in the press or on television. And there was a major change of scale. Like the main newspapers, they sell a few thousand, or the main newspaper, the New York Times, they have around 10 million subscribers. The Economist has 1.5 million subscribers. But Facebook has 3 billion users. So we not only lost a minimum control of authenticity, of veracity, and of civility, but we also started to reach a number very impressive of people that we didn't have before. And that added, of course, the freedom to people utter any kind of views, being totally unprepared. So we have misinformation, we have lack of civility, we have conspiracy theories, we have hate speech, which is also a major problem. So I think the internet had many good points, but it kind of opened the avenues for a kind of human, and one point, Nala, I want to mention here that doesn't go to the credit of the human condition. We are much more mobilized by lies, by aggressive, by hate, than by moderate speech. And since the social media, the digital platforms, they live out of engagement, and since these bad things bring more engagement, they have the wrong incentives.
Rosie, just back to you again about the kind of language that we're hearing from leaders like Bolsonaro's vulgar attack on Justice Barroso and Trump's famous grab him comment. Philippine President Duterte has a catalog of rape jokes. There's clearly a gendered issue here. I wonder what you think accounts for this kind of behavior by these men who are in those positions of power.
Because they can.
Yeah.
They are allowed to say what they want because we have an unhealthy obedience to the superiority of speech as the one untouchable in the constitutional catechism in the United States. And that's an export around the world. You can say whatever you want to whoever you want. We don't have that in Canada. You don't have that in Brazil. I don't know what the law is in India. But if you're not prepared to make distinctions about what speech is tolerable and what isn't, which runs up against the danger that happens in authoritarian governments where they stop speech. I mean, there is a continuum that we have to be aware of. Stopping all speech which is critical of government, which is what they're doing, versus stopping speech which undermines the ability of democracies to function, and it's done in the name of democratization. All of this social media is part of, we can let people say whatever they want. It's a real danger, I think, in not understanding that you can go so far in what you're prepared to let people say and do, that it becomes, that conversation and meaningful dialogue is replaced by rhetorical jargon, which replaces analysis. And I don't know how you fix that, except you have to say no to certain kinds of conversations that are diminishing of our respect of other people.
Yeah. Vikas, what do you think is at play in those kinds of gendered attacks? On some of, let's be honest about this, on women, on visible minorities, especially in positions of power. What is it that drives that kind of behavior by these men in power?
Well, I think that's a question you should ask a psychoanalyst, male testosterone and what it is that is driving that kind of a thing. But it is a reality that we are living with. And I think that is really what is contributing to incivility. I mean, Jean Charest just wrote this open letter on the decline of civility even in Canada. And I think he's quoted, the mayor of Gatineau had to resign because she just could not tolerate all the racist and vile abuses that were coming her way. 800 councillors in Canada have resigned, predominantly women, I would imagine.
Absolutely.
Because it's the easiest thing to make threats against women because, they are perceived as the weaker sex, and you feel that, the anonymity of the internet, I think, that is one. This is a phenomenon called de-individuation, which means that you can be anonymous and you have no consequences for your online behavior. And I think that is what is enabling these cyber trolls, these cyber bullies, to go particularly after women who they feel challenge their notions of either masculinity or democracy or whatever it is. Yeah, so I certainly feel. But to come back to this whole debate on civility, I think Michael Ignatieff, to my mind, made the most important comment. He said it some years ago. He said politicians have to understand the difference between an enemy and an adversary. An adversary is someone you have to defeat, but an enemy is someone you have to destroy. Until you make that distinction, because when you accept an adversary, you accept someone as a legitimate rival. He or she has an equal place to debate issues with you in politics. But when you treat that person as an enemy, then you basically take away, and that is really what is happening. These women and all, they are not treated as legitimate rivals. They are treated as objects that you can discard and that you can throw as much mud as you want against them.
First, go ahead, Rosie, and then I'll ask you a question.
When you talk about the machismo behind some of the language, it's bullying.
Yeah, it is.
It's not conversation. It is. It's the reason that Canada, in its Whatcott decision, said that you can stop discriminatory speech that creates a vilification, a demonization of people, so that they are not feeling like they can participate. Because one of the things the decision said was, it doesn't create freedom of expression to allow hate speech. It silences, as Vic has said. It makes people who are vulnerable, who are the people who are being attacked, usually, afraid to speak up and do anything in response. Bullying is not a conversation either. Yeah. But do we stop bullies? And again, you've got the metaphor in the United States where refugees are called vermin by somebody who wants to be president of the United States and has millions of supporters. How did it happen that in a civilized Western democracy, we tolerate the abuse of people for no reason other than the fact that they find themselves in a particularly vulnerable place in their life? I mean, that isn't the North America that we grew up knowing, but it's become too many parts of the world.
Roberta, I wanted to ask you mentioned social media earlier. What I think is one of the most difficult things about social media is the fact that it promotes certainty. That, as you said, those islands of people who agree with you, echo chambers. If you could speak a little bit more about how you think that changes the conversation in a place like Brazil, where, as we mentioned earlier, 57%, we didn't mention the number in Brazil, of people are open to the idea of an alternate non-democratic leadership.
Well, I think the first thing we Democrats need to do is to recognize that the rise of authoritarian populism flows through the shortcomings of democracy. And I think that's something we should have in mind. Democracy did not offer equal opportunities for everyone and prosperity for everyone. And so this is still a goal that we should not forget, because we have a problem with democracy. Besides that, Nala, I think one thing that happened in the world that helped the authoritarian populism was a certain capture by the conservative camp by the far right. So being a conservative is legitimate as being a liberal or being a progressive. But once you are captured by the far right, that means intolerance. That means not accepting the other to be different. That's willing to strip the other of his rights. And I think, yeah, that's a main problem. And the far right uses as one of its main strategy the character assassination, the conspiracy theories, the hate speech. That's a strategy. And if you talk to those people, the reason why they justify this unethical behavior is that they have the feeling that everything is taken. Like the communists took over, the progressives took over. So anything I do is legitimate. It's almost like a guerrilla against the establishment because they feel that they could not win playing the game in a really decent way. So we are dealing with a strategy. And the only thing I can think besides regulation is media education, is trying to educate people. And one thing that we might have done wrong, we lived for many decades, I would say, an era of the advancement of human rights, of women's rights, of African descendant rights, indigenous people's rights, gay LGBT people rights. And many people on the right think that they feel excluded. They feel like those were victories from the progressive camp. And one thing we need to do, I think, is to convince them that those are not progressive causes. Those are the causes of humanity, treating everyone equally. So I think we have a lot of work to do, and we should not fall into the trap of fighting back in the same way they fight and start lying or start being authoritarian. So if we think good is more powerful than evil, we got to stick to our own values and try to convince people that we're doing the right thing. But we need to do the right thing.
I'd not only endorse the concern about the far right, I would say that we are living in an era where the far right and the far left, the extremes have occupied the middle. And there's no middle anymore because its ideological spectrum makes no room for the possibility of having, you are in control on the far right, you are control in the far left, you demand ideological compliance. That's what's happened. There's no more range of perspectives that you're allowed to have. And that's pretty scary because we used to know very well where the middle was. Your point, that's a very interesting point about identity politics being used against human rights, because the whole purpose of the human rights movement since World War II was the ever-expanding inclusion of people who used to be excluded. And we came to understand that women hadn't been properly treated. People with different sexual identities weren't properly treated. We had language rights in this country, indigenous rights, all evolutionary rights. I think Canada did it better, I have to say, because we accepted the possibility not of a melting pot which does not exist. We said, you come into Canada as a hyphenated person. You belong. We will accommodate your difference as long as you stick to the core national values that we have, but you are a Canadian based on your identity. That's made multiculturalism work better, I think, in Canada than it does anywhere else. The notion that everyone is an equal in the sense that they have the same right to enter the mainstream based on who they are. They don't have to pretend to be a white, able-bodied, heterosexual male to to be part of the mainstream.
And look, adding a little bit to your definition of civility, civility is rooted in the idea of equality. We are all equal. We all have the same right to be here and to be respected and not disqualified. And I think civility also means that, not being disqualified, not being treated as inferior.
But let me go back to the point that you raised, a very good one, that people turn to these authoritarian leaders in part because they feel aggrieved or they feel that the system is rigged against them. And I'm wondering what you would say, how you would counter the argument to those people who say that restoring civility is purely maintaining the status quo and keeping the power with the people who have it today. What would be your argument against that?
I would understand but not agree. Of course, in life sometimes you need fight. In life sometimes you need a revolution. In life sometimes you need to fight the status quo. But usually not being civilized won't lead you to a good point. So I think we are better off if we fight with arguments, with ideas. When the Americans tried to bring enlightenment to Iraq with the armed forces, it didn't work. So enlightenment comes with ideas, with arguments, with reason, with science, with humanism. So I think that's what's really revolutionary, is convincing people of what is the right thing to do.
Because I wanted to get you in on this conversation as a novelist, as someone who obviously understands plot lines, you create characters. When you look at what the narrative that is happening now and the threads that are pulling towards the future, what's your concern? Where do you see the story going the way we hold the conversations that we have now?
So the one narrative I'm most worried about is the counter-narrative around notions of truth. As the Oxford Dictionaries reminded us by choosing post-truth as their word of the year in 2016, that we are now living in a post-truth world. In a world in which facts don't matter, evidence does not matter, people will believe in stuff based on emotions and their own personal logic. And I think once that objective standard is lost, then I think we lose everything. Because if there are no facts, if, as Kellyanne Conway said, there are alternative facts, then, where is the basis on which to agree, even if one party is going to invent its own facts? And the real facts, as Justice Barroso said, if a pen, which is blue in color, can be said to be black, without any objective criteria, then really, where is the basis for discussion? So I think that's very important. And I think, civility is important also because that is the basis of democracy. In a democracy, there will always be plural voices. In a plural democracy, you cannot have everybody agreeing on the same thing. So what is the essence of a democracy? That we agree to disagree by agreeing on the ground rules for that disagreement. And those ground rules are, as both the judges have already pointed out, treating each other with respect, with civility, allowing your existence as a legitimate person, not as an interloper. And if those ground rules are disruptive or disrespected, then, as I said, there is no basis for dialogue at all.
Don't you have to start with explaining to people that democracy doesn't mean you can say whatever you want to whomever you want in whatever way you want? Don't we have to be far more public about what we will not tolerate in the area of civility? Now, every judge knows that you will always have people in front of you who feel very strongly that their point of view is right. You have two parties in every case. They come to court believing that the judge should accept their version of the facts put together by a very well-organized lawyer, and the judge rules in favor of one of the two people. The person who didn't win always thinks the judge was wrong and didn't understand the case. So we know that we're never going to get everybody to agree with democracy, with our values. But we have to figure out a way to create a thirst back for those values. We have to show that there's a transcendent need for global civility, global democracy. And I don't know how you do that when people don't know what they're missing. They don't know what they're missing out. We've lost, as David Johnson said in his book, we've lost the capacity for empathy. We're all worried about our own, globally, personally, of course, we're all worried about our own safety, our own betterment, our own advancement. But if we don't understand that our betterment cannot thrive without ensuring that we've looked after the betterment of those we live with in our communities, what the public interest demands, we're not going to get anywhere. But do we have anybody out there in a leadership position making the case? I mean, I'm looking, we had Martin Luther King, the arc of the moral universe, bending towards justice. To me, it's starting to turn into a pretty menacing circle.
What's it looking like to you, Roberto? I mean, you said, sorry, let me just add this. When you were elected at the Supreme Court, you said that a court's virtue can never be measured by the polls. But I wonder if these increasing attacks do undermine the justice system, if they actually have a long-term effect that is adversarial to everyone.
Well, I think if you are a target of harsh criticism for a long time, of course you lose part of your prestige. It's happened in Brazil. The court was elected by a popular president, former president, as a main obstacle to his government. And of course, everything that went wrong, he had someone to blame. What I would like to stress here that the prestige, the importance of a court of justice cannot be measured in polls, in surveys. And I'll give you an example that might sound clear. I am the rapporteur of a case in which I have invaders in indigenous lands. So there were 5,000 invaders and 1,000 indigenous there. And I had the federal police remove the 5,000 people. It was tough, it took months, it was very difficult. If you have a survey there, I'm going to lose 5-1 because there were more invaders than indigenous.
Right.
So of course, a court of justice, when it interprets the Constitution, it's always displeasing someone. In my country, where we have a very comprehensive constitution that deals with many more issues than the Canadian Basic Freedom Act and the U.S. Constitution, we are always displeasing either the indigenous communities or the farmers, either the government or the taxpayers. So being a judge, as I joked before, you need to have a good psychoanalyst because you are always being rejected. And people that support you today will reject you tomorrow. So this is part of our role. And we have to, I'm not saying that courts don't make mistakes because they do. And what? They do. They do. The other judges do.
I don't think that's true.
It never happened.
No.
It never happened to you.
Not in Canada.
It never happened to you. But even I have written dissenting opinions. Rosie has written dissenting opinions. So democracy is not the regime of consensus. It's the regime in which disagreement is absorbed in a civilized, institutional fashion, I would say. So I have disagreed with my courts in the way we fought corruption, for example. And I put my arguments on the table. Sometimes I won, sometimes I lost. And I think any institution can be improved. But one thing is criticism heading to improve an institution. And the other thing is a destructive behavior regarding institutions. So, and when I said civility can always be preserved, we saw the gay movement, the women's movement, even the black movement, it wasn't through violence, it was through convincing people that it was unfair, that it was not legitimate, that you cannot discriminate for someone for something that he cannot be blamed for. So I do trust civility is the main tool to achieve change in the world.
And you've all said that that is the ideal, is to return to civility, but can we actually put the genie back in the bottle? Vikas, is that actually doable?
Well, in the age of social media, it's going to be increasingly difficult. So I would say we have to start with the schools. If schools start teaching civility, treating each other with empathy, with kindness, and then I think that's the building block. Because if you have children who are growing up into adults, becoming politicians or whatever, who are socialized into the value of civility, then, but of course, that's a long-term solution.
But social media, as we've talked about previously, not only has made conversation difficult, but it has even led to people killing other people. I mean, Facebook
No,
previously.
absolutely.
So
And the reason
how
is
do you come
why-
back from that?
Yeah, so it's going to be very difficult. I mean, I start my new, yet-to-be-released novel with the sentence, "The most valuable thing in the world is not money, it is attention." Because if you look at it...
Star for your movie yet? I'm retired. I now have some time. Just saying.
So you see, when we had the agricultural economy, the most scarce thing was land. When we had the manufacturing economy, the most scarce thing was labor. When we had the knowledge economy, the most scarce thing was information. But now we have a surfeit of information. What we are lacking is attention. And because we are living in this attention-based economy, the business model of the attention-based economy is the social media. All these big tech companies, they are surviving entirely on the basis of our clicks and our likes. And that is why they prioritize that kind of content which will grab the most eyeballs. And what is that content? That content is basically content which basically arouses some kind of an emotion in you. So it is the outrage economy. Malcolm Turnbull, the former Prime Minister of Australia, he called it angertainment. That's what we are living in. And because social media algorithms are designed to promote this kind of a content, it's going to promote even more and more polarization and divisiveness in society. And that is why I think social media, as Justice Barroso said, is the most important building block here. If social media can be brought to heel, as the Europeans are trying to do through the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act, basically telling them that, look, you have to be responsible for the content you put online.
But if social media is essentially an extension of people's actual opinions, is it just a symptom of the problem? Is the problem deeper than just shutting down social media?
No, but you see, it will address one of the core, the drivers of this. That once you suck out the attention from that attention-based economy, then there is no incentive for them to engage in those kinds of behaviors. But as long as that incentive remains, that look, the eyeballs will only come with that kind of a content, which is openly designed to promote incivility, discord, and those kinds of things.
I don't disagree with anything that has been said, but I am a little less confident about, maybe it's the Hobbesian in me. I think changing attitudes is really important because it does change behavior over time. But I really have come to believe that unless you require behavior to change, which then changes attitudes, it's not going to happen. If you look at the social revolutions of our lifetime, gay rights, women's rights, indigenous rights, race, it came from law. We waited 60 years between Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, where the American Supreme Court said separate cars for colored people are okay, are constitutional, until we got Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. And in the meantime, while we were waiting for attitudes to change, blacks in America had to endure segregation. Korematsu, both countries had Supreme Court decisions that said it was okay for Japanese Americans and Canadians to be put in camps, dislocated, removed from their homes. We waited because that was the consensus, but unless you have laws that determine what the parameters of conduct are, you're not going to get people to change. Your point, I think, was a very good one, Nala, and that is you can't blame social media. What I see social media's failures as representing is we didn't have a solid enough pre-foundation. It was fertile soil that social media landed in and allowed all of this disparate hate to fulminate because there wasn't anything there to kind of counteract the impressions. So we do need to say what is acceptable and what isn't, and not be afraid to draw those lines so that people know what they can and can't do and say. But we also need to be prepared to put in place the regulatory mechanisms and the legal mechanisms to minimize the harm, not to stop it, because that's authoritarianism, but to attenuate the impact we know is happening when we allow things to just go unfettered. Let me make one point to agree with you about something. When the courts have been very aggressively pro-rights, it has, in fact, been the case that there's a reaction. So people said, Roe v. Wade, why are you deciding this? People like Ruth Bader Ginsburg said this shouldn't be decided by the courts, leave it to time. People will decide for themselves when the right time is. And the court stepped in 1971 and said, no, it's time to protect women with the choice, reproductive choice. That upset a lot of people, as did Brown. And they waited, and the sore festered, and then they decided they were going to have a different kind of scrutiny for people on the Supreme Court of the United States, and then the Federalist Society was created. So there is always a reaction. But that's not an argument against judges doing it. It is an argument against creating the kind of environment where the opposition to the expansion of rights is accepted as a legitimate way for society to move forward. That's the extremism that you were talking about. So I think everybody in this room would probably share the values. We're not the problem.
How could a court not do it? I had this debate with our friend Bart Tushnet at Harvard some time ago, and he changed his mind, and he had the view that anything that's fair and legitimate one day should prevail in the public space. And I said, well, I agree. But what would a court of justice tell a gay couple that wants to marry now, or a woman that needs to interrupt a pregnancy now, or to a black family that needs affirmative action now? Should we tell them history is a little bit late, wait a while? So we have to decide. There's no way we should not play this role. And usually people that say you should wait for Congress, people that don't want the change. It's usually what happens. And I agree with one thing that Rosie said, but I just want to...
one thing?
One thing.
Name 5.
Yeah, no, this is the only one. I want to mitigate it a little bit. I think law is very important. But you need to have a social movement behind it, or it won't happen.
You can create it.
Brown,
Can't you create
Brown
it with
actually
law?
was enforced with the civil rights movement. So you cannot change
That's
the
true.
world through law or through court decisions. Court decisions help, like in Brazil, and I was a lawyer at the time. I was the lawyer of the case. The same-sex marriage, it was unthinkable when we filed the lawsuit in 2008, I'd say. But when it was finally decided in 2011, it had the majority of the court for the reason that the court and the law brought the issue to the public space and to social discussion, and that was very important. So I totally agree that we need law, but law might be the end of the process sometimes, not the beginning. Or sometimes it could be the beginning, but it's not enough. You still need a social movement to make it happen.
But going back to the idea that a liberal democracy is a faith-based system without the theology, and if these attacks continue from above and below, if people lose faith in the justice system, if this lack of faith becomes permanent, how can an institution like a Supreme Court still do its duty?
Then it becomes even more important that a Supreme Court do its duty. I mean, there have always been movements against what Supreme Courts who do their job properly, unlike with, I was going to say with respect, but I don't mean it, unlike what's happening south of the border, where the Supreme Court is eroding and pulling back settled rights and expectations that had been confirmed for Americans for 50 years. That is not the role of a Supreme Court. I think the delegitimization comes from courts not performing their assigned jobs properly. In the American environment, their delegitimization is self-inflicted. I don't think, well, I shouldn't say that. I think half the country may agree with what the American Supreme Court is doing. I just don't think it's the job of a Supreme Court to restrict rights. I think the whole purpose of a constitution is to protect and expand them. But I also really worry about the fact that unless you get the public on board and understanding how important this is, then even if there's backsliding because there's a huge movement against a particular decision, then you have to have a culture where people, as they have in Canada, allowed the decision to take root and see what happens. So because we never know in advance whether what we're going to do is popular, and because it never enters the mix, we know what our friends think because we talk to them. But do we know what real people on the street think? I don't think so. So you have to do what you think is best as an institution that guards the Constitution. And if you do it according to what you think is best, then I think you protect the legitimization in the eyes of time. And I have come to think that a court's judge is time, not the moment, not the agitations of the moment. So we'll see how time judges the American Supreme Court. We know how time has judged what you've done when you've been brave. Will people be annoyed by what you did in getting rid of a government that was corrupt? Maybe, but you had no choice. You were following the law.
Rosie, I found it interesting that Nala said democracy is a faith, and it is. Because you have to believe in things that you don't see, you don't touch separation of powers. You don't. There was a famous saying by an Italian jurist, and he said, justice, like any other goddess, only appears to those who believe in it. And democracy is pretty much the same thing. You need to believe it, and when it fails, you need to try again. Because the options, and I live in a country that has tried the option. We had a 21-year dictatorship, and the cost is very high, and you have to rebuild things after it. So democracy is very complicated, very complicated. However, the options are much more costly, I would say. One thing that scares me, though, as a Democrat, and we should give some thinking to it, is the success of some countries that are not democratic. And that could be an appeal, like China, I think it's the best example. China did remove millions of people out of poverty. And although I think that could be done differently, there are many people that are attracted to that alternative, because indeed, to decide things without needing to negotiate, to compromise, is much easier. But at the end of the day, the price is higher.
Do you know the fact that you said 21 years of a dictatorship that you endured, that comes back to the concern that I have, how long we have put up with dictatorships all over the world in the name of democracy. It's not our business to tell you how to do things. But we have laws, rules, treaties, conventions in place that forbids the very thing that you're talking about, and nobody enforces them. And that needs to be a serious conversation. So I believe in the faith of democracy. I believe that good people will believe and do believe democracy, but I also believe that you have to enforce it. And you have to insist on compliance with the laws you've got, or nobody's going to believe in law. So I think we've been way too kind to tolerating intolerance in this world.
So as a final round, if I could ask each of you, starting with you, Vikas, then Roberto, and then you, Rosie, just a final thought on what one thing you think that needs to be done to, if that is the right word, restore civility.
No, as I said, I believe that incivility, the root cause of incivility is this trolling, etc., that we are seeing. I mean, this polarization of the discourse. There are long-term solutions, of course. You have to reduce the income inequality, within societies, which is fueling the populist upsurge, which is not a small job at all. So that's what I'm saying. There are some long-term strategies that you can use, and there are some short-term strategies. And the short-term strategies are control social media.
Roberto?
Well, I think there are roles for the government in regulating many things. I think there is a role for business, even the big techs, like using technology to fight a few things. But I do believe in society, in ethical and spiritual evolution, and I think that's what we should invest on.
Rosie, final word.
I don't know. I really don't know. The only thing that people...
I didn't know we had that option.
You can have a crack at it if you want.
I learned it on the bench. You can do whatever you want. No,
Rosie,
I don't see.
if faith evaporates, what takes its place?
Well, I think we need more success stories in this world. We need more countries like Canada. We need to show the world that it is a good investment to protect democracy, because everything they've got in their autocratic regimes, security, safety, economic development, if that's the tangent package that attracts them, we have to plus the right to say what you want without hurting other people, the right to be a full member of society, the right to aspire to everything that you want for your family, the right to hope. That's part of democracy, and we have to sell it. And we have to stop being shy about saying that it is the best system. Liberal democracy is the best system for everyone, and we've got to stop pretending that there are other ways that are just as good just because they're not ours. So I would put my foot down and say enough. I mean, look, is this working for us? This tolerance of intolerance all over the world? So I would start promoting democracy, civility, respect, dignity, all the things that we thought we were doing 75 years ago, and bring it back.
Wonderful way to end this conversation. Thank you, all three of you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Merci d'être venu ici si nombreux ce soir. My name is Daniel Bélan. I'm the director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada. And as director, I want to thank our wonderful panelists, Judge Rosie Abella, Luis Roberto Barroso, Vika Swarup, for their insight. And I have to say that it was really an insightful conversation. And of course, I want to thank Nala Hayed for her wonderful work. I've been discussing with Nala and her team for months now to prepare this evening, and I have to say that such professionalism is really outstanding. what I want to thank, of course, very, very briefly, all the people who were involved in making this, this first conversation sponsored by Charles Bronfman a success. Of course, the staff at MISC, our board members, and Alex and other people that were involved directly in this, like Ann Datsun. I want to thank the leadership at McGill University, who was really very supportive of this. I want to thank the entire team at the CBC, who has been, of course, very, very helpful and collaborative in this project. And of course, I want to thank the most important people, the men who made this possible. Actually, the men who made MISC possible in the first place, the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, long time ago, but also the men we have to thank for this event tonight, but also for the conversations for the years and decades to come, Charles Bronfman. So thank you very much, Charles. Merci, Charles. As we heard tonight, civility is indeed a central aspect of liberal democracy, and we must do everything to protect this reality, to protect civility. And I want to go back to this letter that was published in the Globe and Mail with many different signatories, including Jean Charest, who is here with us tonight. And as stated in the letter, quote, Canadians with different perspectives and lived experiences need to be working together instead of retreating to the familiarity of our echo chambers to lob hurtful tropes at each other, end of quote. Civility is now a major topic here in Canada, and today I would say the timing of this event was just incredible, and the theme of civility was actually suggested by Rosie Abella. And I think that we realize, since we thought about making this theme of the conversation months ago, that today is even more urgent than ever to think about civility, to talk about civility, to teach about civility, because the importance of education, and yes, primary, secondary education is really crucial here, but it's also very important in our universities. And by the way, I have colleagues who teach about Middle Eastern politics here at McGill. And they have been discussing the situation in the Middle East in recent months with their students. And they were able to actually have real conversations with students who don't agree on core issues, to have thoughtful discussions, and to maintain a level of civility in the classroom. This is what higher education and what education is about, and we need to emphasize that in universities and well beyond. According to Matteo Bonotti and Stephen Zeck, civility has two main dimensions, quote. The first, politeness, and we talked about politeness earlier, and it's important, especially here in Canada. Sorry, but that's true. And so politeness is related to norms of etiquette and good manners. The second dimension of civility, public-mindedness, involves treating others as free and equal members of society, end of quote. And that means also the idea of mutual respect. So politeness without mutual respect is pure surface. But I do think that politeness is a good start, but we need more than just politeness. Without civility, liberal democracy becomes increasingly impossible to sustain, as we discussed this evening. And I do think that we need to stand up for liberal democracy and civility and study civility. And I think that's the work of social scientists. Of course, civility is an important concept in political theory as well. And I think that scholars have a role to play in steering the public conversation in the right direction. And we saw that tonight. And this is something that is very important for McGill and for our institute. Civility is not only timely, but it's timeless. And a foundational goal of the conversation, sponsored by Charles Bronfman, is to foster constructive, thoughtful, and respectful discussions about Canada and its place in the world. This first conversation and its focus on civility is setting the tone for the entire series of conversations for the years and decades to come. And we hope that these conversations will help us think about our collective future in a civil but really thoughtful manner. Merci beaucoup. Bonne fin de soirée. Thank you very much. Thank you.